Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the peacekeeping force standing up to Israel in southern Lebanon.
It's an egregious violation in my view. The actions are reckless and they need to be accountable in terms of what is happening.
After repeated Israeli attacks and demands for their withdrawal, UN peacekeeping forces are staying put. So where does this standoff end? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
UNIFIL really are there to observe and monitor. They're not there to attack, fight, or defend. They're there to be observers on the ground, to be the eyes and ears of the world. My name is Dr. Shelley Deane. I'm a researcher at Dublin City University, and I'm speaking to you from Dublin.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you back on the podcast, Shelley. The recent Israeli attacks on UNIFIL peacekeepers has gotten a lot of attention around the world and in Ireland, where you're from, because there are 380 Irish peacekeepers in Lebanon as part of that force in the south. And the areas around the outposts that they oversee have seen some pretty fierce fighting since Israel invaded Lebanon. Bring us up to speed on what's happened so far.
Well, the Irish UNIFIL soldiers have been in South Lebanon for the best part of 46 years, but over time, there have been increasing escalations of conflict and kinetic conflict in the area throughout that period. Most recently, when the Israelis initiated their offensive in South Lebanon 3 weeks ago, the Irish UNIFIL soldiers are, along with the rest of the UNIFIL peacekeeping forces, are the front line really for what's happening in South Lebanon. In the last week, there have been escalation in kinetic activity between the Israeli Defense Forces and UNIFIL positions and UNIFIL observation posts in South Lebanon. The issues have been included the IDF driving a tank into one of the UNIFIL compounds, insisting that if the UNIFIL turn off the lights for 45 minutes, and then dispensing noxious substances that have left 15 of the UNIFIL peacekeepers with respiratory injuries and skin allergies.
Wow.
So there's been an escalation in the inclusion of and targeting of UNIFIL positions and posts. They've undermined the capacity to resupply certain outposts, and the Israeli tanks have surrounded outposts and directed their weaponry at the UNIFIL posts.
So you mentioned UNIFIL is this international force. It is mandated by the UN to keep the peace in southern Lebanon. And in the past week, Israel has injured some of those peacekeepers, and that includes peacekeepers from places like Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Shelley, I know that you've spent a lot of time in Lebanon. You've met and worked with these peacekeepers in their current positions and when they leave the mission. There is a reason that statements from the Irish Taoiseach and others in government in Ireland that their troops are not leaving there have resonated with people.
I think we have seen yet another line crossed by Israel. Peacekeepers and peacekeeping is protected by international law.
The history of Irish peacekeepers in southern Lebanon goes way back, as you mentioned, to the point that some local Lebanese even speak with a bit of an Irish accent.
Tell me about the Irish and how
The Irish are great. They're protecting my family. And I'm working with them now since about 32 years now.
I can hear it in your voice and your accent.
I sure will. You get it anyways.
Not something we've seen online recently, people passing these around, these videos and these clips around in shock in the midst of this horror that's unfolding behind us. But there's something in there that's resonating with people. Can you talk to me about that connection that exists between Ireland and Lebanon?
Well, the Irish have been in Lebanon since 1978, so there's a very long history. Over 30,000 Irish peacekeepers have been back and forth to Lebanon, often on more than one tour. So regularly you will have Irish peacekeepers who go back and forth to Lebanon. But the Irish have a soft spot for Lebanon, not least because of the history and the graw is the Irish word for love we have for Lebanon. The reason the Lebanese in South Lebanon tend to learn English or speak English with an Irish accent is because we're really the native English speakers of the peacekeeping world in South Lebanon, which means that locals will hear Irish English accents regularly and often, and it might be the easiest to pick up. I noticed that when I was in Bershed, which is one particular village not far from Tibneen, where the Irish are based, the people sounded like me, because they sound as though they come from Athlone, the middle of Ireland, which is quite entertaining when you find yourself in the middle of South Lebanon and you hear colloquialisms that you don't expect to hear. So there's a great affinity and a relationship forged over 46 years, which means that Irish people refer to Lebanon as the Lebanon, and it feels as though it's a spare county for us in the sense of the affinity people have. And because of the families of the peacekeepers who have updates on Irish radio to say, here's what's happening today around this observation post.
Can I ask you first of all about this strike in northern Lebanon? It was pretty unusual in A, the fact that it occurred in the north of the country, and B, that it occurred in a predominantly Christian town.
It's very familiar and it's very close. And I think it speaks to the desire to maintain the connection. And while the UNIFIL is mandated to stay, and Ireland cannot unilaterally withdraw its peacekeepers, certainly there's a desire to maintain that connection for the majority, but not all Irish people. But the majority of people want to see the peacekeepers do the role that they're mandated for well in South Lebanon.
I'm glad you raised that distinction that, again, because this is an international force, Ireland can't make the unilateral decision to stay or to go. This is a body that makes that decision. And that body knows that peacekeeping is obviously not without risks. By definition, you are putting yourself in harm's way. But being directly targeted, which is what UNIFIL says is the case in these incidents, seems less common. How significant of a moment in history do you think this is?
It's definitely an escalation. But for this iteration of conflict, it's an escalation. And you could argue that it's attributed to a new Israeli approach of reconnaissance by fire. So rather than have a policy of react or respond to attack with defense or deterrence, instead it's reconnaissance by fire and it's provocation. But it's not the first time that Israel has been accused of targeting UN compounds. The case of 1996 in the village of Kana, which I learned the village of Kana has been attacked again. So in 1996, the Israelis informed Lebanese in South Lebanon to vacate their areas or they will be assumed to be Hezbollah position not far from the UN compound in Kana. The Hezbollah position identified Israeli special forces and mortared the Israeli special forces. And in return, the Israelis used 36 rounds of high explosive shells, killing 100 people who had sought sanctuary in the UN compound. The impact of Kana demonstrated that even when it was alleged that even when UNIFIL called to say you've hit the compound, the shells didn't stop coming. So there's a huge challenge around targeting or either targeting or error. Kana was hit again in 2000. And so it's a very unfortunate village that it's perpetually targeted, but the UN compound was the beginning of a change in the way that Israel focused on, is indiscriminate in the way it identifies targets.
Well, as a researcher and someone who has a long view of history on this, the fact that you did just see the news that it was hit again, that Kana was struck again, what goes through your mind? Is this history repeating itself with even more dire consequences?
Well, my concern is that the academics would say it's a punctuated equilibrium. So you have repeated events that seem to replicate over time. And if you didn't know the date, you might think that what we were discussing was today rather than 1996. Right. So without your dates, it all feels very familiar and could be confused, which is a huge problem when you're trying to understand what's happening. But what's increasingly challenging is, and what's worth noting, is that Israel's strategic plan for Lebanon is not clear. I mean, how the plan is any different than it was in the first invasion in 78, the subsequent invasion in 82, 2000, 2006, you have a real sense of how Israel's plan for South Lebanon has never manifested. The plan was to have a security zone in South Lebanon as far as the Litani River, so a buffer zone, if you like, in South Lebanon. Thus far, they've been unsuccessful. Israel unilaterally withdrew in 2000 when the Israeli Prime Minister said that they would withdraw from South Lebanon. And for many in Israel, South Lebanon is perceived as their Vietnam, because so many of IDF is a conscript army. So many of them ended up losing their lives in South Lebanon, that it was seen to be incredibly problematic for them. And then to re-invade South Lebanon suggests that the Israelis see it as unfinished business and retaliation for repeated Hezbollah shelling. And it's a huge challenge, and it is a concern.
More with Shelley after the break. So Shelley, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has denied that UNIFIL is being directly targeted. He said it's completely false. He also brought up another party in the conflict in a message about this incident, and that party is Hezbollah.
Israel is not fighting UNIFIL. It's not fighting the people of Lebanon. It is fighting Iran's proxy Hezbollah, which uses Lebanese territory to attack Israel.
What do you make of his recent comments and this viewpoint that this was not a direct hit, even though UNIFIL says it was?
The reality of Lebanon is such that the proximity, the area, logistically, the area is small. The topography of South Lebanon is such that everything is all but within visual distance. Everything is visible. The likelihood of Hezbollah being adjacent to or in proximity to UN compounds is very high. So UNIFIL compounds are spelled out. They're self-evident on the maps. The argument that it wasn't targeted, either it suggests that it's incompetence or it's targeting, and either have ramifications for Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces and its capacities. But certainly Hezbollah has places and spaces where it can target Israeli forces and the IDF. And by virtue of the nature of the space, it is a very small space. And so the reality is that the UNIFIL forces are a buffer to try and de-escalate rather than facilitate escalation. And the worry is that the removal of UNIFIL forces from South Lebanon would escalate and create an increasingly kinetic conflict in South Lebanon, and that would not end well.
Because their removal will remove the eyes and ears of this force who is witnessing or bears witness to what takes place. But is there more beyond bearing witness if they are not mandated to take action?
Well, I think the worry is that there will be a suggestion of a multinational force rather than UNIFIL or in tandem with UNIFIL. And historically, the implementation of a multinational force in Lebanon doesn't bode well. In 1982, a multinational force was brought into Beirut. It was supposed to stay 30 days. It left after 10. So, and a consequence of that after that was the Shabra and Shatia massacres in Beirut. So we need to be very mindful about what we're proposing and suggesting in a bid to try and, we mustn't react, we must respond with thought. And one could argue that the targeting or the identifying or assaults on UNIFIL positions is really a bait and switch. It's a direct redirection from the reality that in South Lebanon we currently have an Israeli force in South Lebanon that has relocated 1.2 million people. Understanding that 60,000 Israelis have relocated from northern Israel too. This is definitely a security situation. There's a vulnerability for both Lebanon and for Israel. But the reality is that we need not think that removing UNIFIL is any remedy to that particular challenge. It's not.
Well, Shelley, I want to take this back to Ireland, because earlier we talked about Ireland's strong history with UNIFIL and the fact that they've been there more than 46 years, you said, in southern Lebanon. I am curious how this story then is playing out at home. Do people want Irish troops to come home in the face of this danger? Is there a sense of needing to stay there because of what you're saying, the importance of this mission?
Opinion is not quite polarized, but there are differences of opinion. Historically, Ireland's role as a neutral state is part of its foreign policy identity at present. But there are increasing calls to recalibrate or review or revise Ireland's role as a neutral state, which is sort of part of a domestic conversation in Ireland. Increasingly, though, Ireland's position internationally is that we have a duty of care, and it's part of our role as Ireland's peacekeepers are an integral part of Ireland's foreign policy. We are a trained army. The Irish Defence Forces know exactly what they're coming up against. They're experts. They've been in peace building roles and peacekeeping roles for the last 60 years. So we're well versed in anticipating and being aware of the vulnerabilities. But needless to say, there are some pockets of opinions in Ireland that maybe think a little bit differently and think it's time to bring peacekeepers home. When these are soldiers, they joined the Irish Defence Forces knowing that they would have peacekeeping duties all over the world, and Irish peacekeepers have been all over the world for 60 years. Lebanon is just one of the longest and most close to our hearts position, but certainly one could argue that there's a need for a more dynamic mandate, arguably, for UNIFIL in South Lebanon. Maybe the mandate needs to be strengthened or enforced or supported with consensus, of course, from the Security Council and others. But I think our current commitment is robust and thorough, despite maybe the minority voices who might be louder than their support might suggest.
Interesting. Well, I'm interested in your personal take on this, Shelley, because as we said, you have worked with peacekeepers formerly and those who were still in the force. What is that job like? What should people know?
I think it's the commitment of Irish peacekeepers on an individual level. So I've worked with Irish peacekeepers on demining, on distributing humanitarian support. So they currently they're working in hospitals to support people who haven't got access to health resources in South Lebanon. But in the past, they worked with me on education and better community relations, engaging with people in that sense. Liaison was a key factor of their role between the Israelis and the Lebanese government. So they liaise between different organizations, but increasingly their humanitarian role speaks to their commitment to South Lebanon. I've also worked with people who left the Irish army and then returned to Lebanon to work on demining. So demining South Lebanon, where unfortunately, as a consequence of the 2006 war, where Israel left anti-personnel munitions behind, there's an iron harvest for South Lebanese farmers when they retrieve anti-personnel devices rather than onions. So
an iron harvest. I haven't heard that before, but it's what a euphemism for what is such a deadly find.
Well, there are stories, and the peacekeepers will tell you, or the deminers will tell you, that farmers will appear with a crate full of unexploded ordnance and say, "I don't know what to do with these." And of course, they're dangerous, and they have to clear their fields so that they can grow vegetables and fruit and things. So that's what's a huge challenge. But I think that Irish peacekeepers, all peacekeepers are committed, and I think there's an affinity for people in place, and the fact that the peacekeepers learn languages, they observe, many of them are doing masters and so on, and they understand what's happening from a geopolitical point of view and in international relations and an international security point of view. So their insights are incredibly valuable. In addition to that, they're armed and trained and capable, but lightly armed. But their role is to observe and to document and to learn for Ireland and for South Lebanon. So the learning is crucial. The learning from peacekeepers returns to Ireland, the way Ireland approaches foreign policy more broadly, and has been incredibly enriching for Ireland's approach to its role in the world. And that's something that I think we'd be sorely missing if we were to reduce our UNIFIL approach or reduce our peacekeeping role and obligations.
Yeah.
I may be alone in that thinking, but it's certainly the way I think.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all of our recent content, updated regularly, so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.